Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today I want to show you how to give amazing answers for IELTS Speaking Part 2. This video will expand greatly upon the one up here, which gave some general tips about all three sections of the speaking test. Today though, we're just looking at Part 2, and we'll explore it in much more detail. This video will be divided into 7 sections and is intended to help you score at least Band 7. Each of these sections is a chapter which you can find down below, and you can use these to guide your studies. You can also turn on the option for subtitles so that you can understand me better. Right, let's begin the lesson. Our first tip is to read quickly and carefully. But you might be wondering, isn't this a speaking test? What do I have to read? Well, in Part 2 of the IELTS speaking test, you have to talk about something that is written on a cue card. It looks something like this. When you get the cue card, you only have 1 minute to prepare your answer, so obviously you can't spend ages reading it over and over, trying to interpret it, nor can you take a long time to think of what you want to say. Time is of the essence, so read quickly. To do that, pick out the keywords in the first line, then decide what the whole thing means. Unlike the other parts of the IELTS exam, there's nothing tricky here. They won't give you deceptive questions that could be easily misinterpreted. However, there are some things to consider. Let's say that the cue card says, describe a person you would like to meet. It is important that you don't describe someone that you have already met. This may sound obvious, but in the stress of an exam, people's brains do weird things. Indeed, over that 1 minute preparation time, it is quite easy to forget what the original idea was and talk about something only loosely related. Your brain may remember person and meet, and so you talk about something completely different to what was required. This is something you really should avoid. In IELTS writing, you really should spend some time planning your ideas before you begin the essay, but for speaking the opposite is true. You need to minimize that thinking time. Remember that with just 1 minute to prepare, you have to read the cue card, think of an idea, and then plan your answer. It's actually quite a difficult task. As such, once you have read the cue card and are sure you know what it means, just pick the first good answer that pops into your head and then begin planning. Don't worry if this isn't the ideal choice, just pick something and do your best with it. Let's say that you're asked to describe a restaurant, which by the way I talked about up here. You might immediately think of a fancy French restaurant in your hometown, but then you might wonder maybe it would be easier to talk about that fish and chip shop at the seaside. Or how about that Indian restaurant you visited last week? If you think this way, your 1 minute of preparation time will disappear and you will have done no actual preparation. As such, choose the first idea that pops into your head, as long as it's not completely ridiculous. Even if it is slightly imperfect, just go with it and do your best. Remember that the examiner is not actually that interested in what you're talking about. They're just thinking about your fluency, your vocabulary, your grammar, and your pronunciation. When people first start practicing for IELTS speaking, they often make a common mistake, which is to write lots of notes. Now this is understandable because it can be scary having to speak for 2 minutes, and just having a page of notes to refer to can give you a lot more confidence. However, whilst confidence is important, you simply don't have enough time to do this. Years ago, I was working with a large group of IELTS students in China, and I conducted a practice speaking session with each of them. For Part 2, almost everyone immediately began writing a sentence. When their 1 minute was over, they looked at me in sheer panic. They hadn't even finished that one sentence. Even if you're an incredibly fast writer, you couldn't write 2 minutes worth of speech in 1 minute, and certainly not after spending part of that same minute reading the cue card and thinking of an answer. It's just not possible. Instead, use your time to jot down a few useful ideas. Some people write words or phrases that might come in handy. Others prefer to sketch out a loose structure, and yet others will note down some ideas. I personally think that the best approach is to write down a few things that you would like to mention later in the answer. Last week I showed you how to describe a polite person, and for that I might have written down a word that would remind me of an example of that person's politeness. This would help me because halfway through my answer I might have forgotten what I originally wanted to say. And this could guide me in the right direction. A piece of advice that I've given often in recent months is to start your answers with a personal story or memory. The reason is simple. When you begin this way, your brain will naturally follow a path of logical ideas. Whilst it is of course difficult to give a long answer in English, your brain can at least move from one idea to the next without struggling with language. Let's say you have to describe a place that you want to visit. Well, most IELTS candidates would start by saying something like, "Today I want to talk about a place I want to visit." It's dull and predictable. It requires you to then transition from that artificial introduction into the next thing, which would probably be dictated by whatever was in the bullet point. Instead, say something like, "When I was young, I always dreamed of going to Paris. There was just something special about how it appeared in the movies that just cried out to me." It's totally different, right? The examiner will be engaged in what you're saying, and your brain will naturally take you to the next point and the next. You still have to think about words and grammar, but the ideas will come much more easily, and you will have a better chance of a good score for fluency. We often think about fluency in a language as the ability to speak quite rapidly, but is that always true? Certainly, being able to speak quickly and accurately is a key part of fluency, but sometimes it's better to slow down in order to be more accurate. In fact, one of the pieces of advice that I most frequently give to my IELTS students is to slow down. This is because when people feel nervous, they speak too quickly. In IELTS, this can have three problems. Firstly, it can cause you to make more mistakes with word choice and grammar. Secondly, it could cause you to run out of ideas. And thirdly, if you said everything very quickly, you might finish in less than 1 minute, which would be disastrous for your final score. Now, talking quickly is a natural thing that occurs because of nervousness, but it is easy to overcome. The first thing is simply to be aware of it. Consciously tell yourself before the exam to stay calm and speak at a moderate pace. You can also reduce your stress levels a bit by taking a deep breath before you begin. Breathing between sentences is also something to practice before the exam. Whilst you don't want to hesitate for too long, those natural pauses can give you time to think and also to avoid your words and ideas running together. So before your next IELTS test, remember, relax. A lot of people forget that IELTS is an English test and that the examiners are not your enemy. They're not the big bad boss at the end of a video game level. They're just normal people who have been trained very well to assign you a score that indicates your English level. If you're given a very difficult question or you encounter some sort of problem along the way, you should tell them clearly and in proper English. Many people think that this will lower your score, but it won't. In fact, by showing that you can communicate, you're giving them reason to give you a score that's actually representative of your level. Let's say you are overcome by nervousness, or you're about to sneeze, or you can't think of an idea because your mind just goes blank. These things happen. They happen to all of us. It does not mean that you can't speak English, but if you try to hide them or let them stop you from speaking, the examiner might just think that you don't know a word. Let's say that you're asked to describe a prize that you've won. Some people have never received a prize, and this could cause them to freeze up. However, it offers an opportunity. If you've never won a prize, you need to explain to the examiner that you haven't, and then transition into something similar. You might say, well, when I first saw the cue card, I was honestly a bit disappointed because I've never actually won a prize. However, 2 years ago, I received a bonus at work, which in some sense could be construed as a sort of prize. This kind of answer turns a disaster into a victory. It takes a problem and completely erases it, showing the examiner that you have the linguistic ability and the intelligence to give a great response, even to a very challenging question. This final tip might seem a bit strange because usually we think about conclusions in terms of essays. However, I think it's good to round off your answer. A lot of teachers tell you to keep talking until the examiner stops you, which is fine, but honestly that often leads to hesitation, repetition, and some other problems. If you have a good sense of time, you can bring your answer to a natural close somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes. By a natural close, I mean ending your answer with some sort of conclusion. You don't have to do it in the same rigid, formal style as an essay, but certainly just avoid stopping. If you were to talk about a job that you would like to do in the future, for example, you might finish by saying, "And that's why I would love to do this job." This is a natural way of concluding, as long as the previous parts were reasons why you wanted to do it. Otherwise, you might add something like, "I hope that through my hard work and determination, along with a little bit of good luck, I am one day able to achieve my goal and get this job." Again, as a satisfying ending. When you consider tip number 4, you now have an answer with a beginning and an ending, making it sound more like a story. This is an incredibly effective way to deliver an answer to most cue cards. Fundamentally, when it comes to IELTS speaking, you will be given an answer that reflects your abilities. If you have great English skills, you'll probably get a great score. If you don't, you probably will get a low score. However, there are of course some things you can do to maximize your chances of success. Whilst you constantly work on improving your grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation, you can also implement these 7 tips in order to make your answers better. By doing all of this, you will be much more likely to get a great score in your next IELTS test.